Hi. So most applications have some form of a data layer, and usually that form of a data layer is more than likely going to end up being a relational database. But we could create a data layer just by storing some data in a file, but we've got to decide what format to use. And an easy format to use would be to store the data in JSON format. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to touch a folder, a file called, I have an empty folder here called app.js. And I'm just going to run nodemon, which I have installed globally, on app.js. And let's open this up. And what my game plan is to have some data and to write that data into a file. So I'm going to need a file. And in order to get a file, I'm going to end up requiring my path module. And for my file, I'm going to say path.join directory name. This doesn't exist yet, but it will after I write the file. This is going to be data.json. And let's just console log it so we can see it. And it's path.join, my mistake. And what I want to do here is I want to have some function that writes some data. So just for the sake of argument, let's say that we have some data, and I want to do something along the lines of write, and I want to write to some file, and my data is going to be some data Mo and Larry. Now, one thing that's important is that I want to save this data as a string because I want to be able to retrieve it as a string. The other thing that I want to do is I want to find out whether or not I'm successful. And I also want to find out if, in fact, I have an error. What could an error be? Well, maybe the data is not an array. That should be a requirement when we end up writing the data. Of course, write doesn't exist, so this will end up failing. And on top of that, I think I've forgotten this as well. So write is not defined. So let's write. Write is going to end up taking, let's say, a file path. And it's also going to end up taking some data. Now, the problem that I have is that the method that I have to write to a file, the problem with it is that it's asynchronous. It ends up taking a callback function. In other words, it's not permissified. I can't run a promise on it, which I would like to do. I'd like to run this without passing in a callback. I'd like to use the promise syntax. So if I just went over here, and I returned a new promise gets passed to functions. It's up to me to decide what happens. And now this won't break, but I'm not going to see any success or any failure. If I was to go over here and say resolve, it would end up saying success. And if I went over here and said reject, I would end up seeing foo. Neither one I want to see. There's a few things that I want to do here before I go in here. One of them is, hey, look, if you send me this data and I look at it, and this is like a very minor form of validation. I want to say, hey, look, did you give me an array? Because that's what I need to store this. That's how my data is being stored. That's what I'm expecting. So I could say, hey, look, if it's not an array, even though this is something I could run synchronously, my code is expecting a promise. So I could say, hey, look, if this is not an array, absolutely nothing else to see here. And I'm just going to go and I'm going to return. I'm done. I want to reject, and I'm going to reject. Data must be an array. Of course, I won't see anything here because this is not going to get rejected, but you could imagine if I came over here and I sent in a string, I would see data must be an array. I'm doing a little bit of validation here. Again, the whole idea is that I want to return a promise if this was successful. The next thing I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to use my FS module. I'm going to end up writing a file. The file is going to be my file path. The data that I put into it, I need to stringify it. I've already found out whether it's an array or not, so I'm going to stringify this data. And the third parameter, the only thing I really care about here is whether or not I have an error or not. Maybe I'll have an error because, who knows, too much data, can't find the file path, any number of things. So I'll go over here, I'll say, hey, look, if there's an error, again, I'm done here. So I'm going to return, not to return anywhere, but just to get out of here. And I'll say I want to reject with whatever the error is. And in this case, what I'm going to get is a bit of an infinite loop, because in fact I was successful, and NodeMon is going to try to keep on running every time it sees that another file changed. In particular, it's looking at JSON files. One of the things that I could do here is I could say, NodeMon, I want you to run app.js. And I could give it an ignore flag. And again, there's ways to make this a little bit more powerful, but if I just do this, it'll ignore that file changing. And I do want to see that success message, so if I make it down here, I'm going to say resolve, meaning that I'm successful. And now we've got a way, and we can actually just see the data, now we've got a way of saving data with JSON data, and just to prove that, right, if we went over here, that this is actually working, I could change this to an uppercase. And if I go back here, it'll ask me to load this file again, and I'll see that data ended up changing. So we've got a very simplistic way to save data to a server in a permissified way with a minimal amount of error handling.